In the Canadian House of Commons on May 27th, 2025, something happened that most political commentary got completely wrong. Mark Carney stood at the dispatch box and faced 4 consecutive rounds of attack from Pierre Poilievre. Gas prices, household debt, property rights, social programs, one after another, no breathing room, no pause. And Carney did not move, not one step back. Now most coverage framed this as a personality contest. Who looked stronger? Who landed the better line? But that framing misses the entire point. What actually happened in that chamber was a collision between two fundamentally different theories of how Canada should be governed during one of the most economically pressured periods in a generation. A trade war with Washington still unresolved, inflation not fully contained, a legal crisis over land ownership in British Columbia that directly affects hundreds of thousands of homeowners right now. I am going to break down every single exchange. I am going to show you what the numbers actually say versus what was claimed at that podium. And I am going to walk you through one legal detail buried inside this debate that almost no one is talking about, but that could affect whether you actually own your home free and clear. Stay with me. Let me set the scene precisely. The House of Commons had just returned from a parliamentary recess. The timing matters. Recesses create political pressure. Members return with accumulated frustration, sharpened talking points, and a public audience that has been waiting. Poilievre walked in with a clear architecture. 4 attack vectors, each one targeting a different pressure point in the Canadian household experience. He was not improvising. This was a deliberate sequence. Poilievre invoked the Harper era of 2014, oil at $100 a barrel globally, Canadian pump prices at $1.38 per liter. His argument, prices were lower than despite higher global oil costs. Therefore, current prices reflect liberal policy failures, not world market conditions. Carney did not defend the number directly. Instead, he pivoted immediately to refinery margins. His claim, refinery margins in Canada have increased by 40 cents, meaning the cost increase Canadians feel at the pump is partly structural, not purely tax-driven. One analyst framing worth considering. Both arguments contain partial truths, operating on different levels of the pricing chain. Global oil prices, refinery margins, carbon pricing, and currency value all interact simultaneously. Neither answer given at that podium was complete. This is where Poilievre introduced third-party data. He cited Equifax figures. Insolvency volumes up 19% year over year, balance delinquency rates climbing 32% year over year, and first quarter insolvency volumes at 17-year highs. These are serious numbers if accurate. Equifax is a credible data source. However, it is worth noting these figures were presented as parliamentary claims and have not been independently verified against the original Equifax report within this analysis. Carney responded with comparative framing, wages growing faster than inflation, inflation lower in Canada than the United States, female employment 5 percentage points above American levels. Canada as the second strongest economy in the G7. Here is what a careful observer would note. Carney consistently chose relative metrics over absolute ones. That is not accidental. Relative comparisons are harder to immediately challenge in real time. They also shift the frame from "are Canadians struggling" to "are Canadians struggling more than others?" Those are two very different questions. When Poilievre pushed on affordability, Carney executed a counter move that reoriented the entire exchange. He reminded the chamber that the Conservative leader has historically opposed childcare, dental care, and pharmacare. One way to read this, Carney was not just defending his record. He was forcing Poilievre to answer an implicit question that Poilievre had not chosen to put on the table. Not why are prices high, but what exactly would you remove if you return to power? That is a strategically significant shift in burden. This was the most legally complex moment of the session, And it deserves its own full examination because buried inside this exchange is a detail that goes well beyond parliamentary theater. It touches a court ruling, a federal guideline, and a question about who holds ultimate legal authority over land in this country. That is where we go next. Here is where the debate stopped being about politics and started being about property law. And if you own a home in British Columbia or plan to, you need to understand exactly what happened in this exchange. Let me give you the foundation first. Earlier this year, the BC Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case involving Cowichan land claims. The court examined the relationship between Aboriginal title and fee simple private property rights. Fee simple is the strongest form of private ownership recognized in Canadian law. It is what most homeowners believe they hold when they buy a property. The court's finding created legal uncertainty about how these two categories of rights interact in specific circumstances. It did not declare that all private property in BC is at risk, but it opened a question that Canadian property law had not fully resolved at the provincial level. That question is now working its way through the appeals process. Here is the first layer that Poilievre exposed. The federal government maintains an internal directive known as Guideline 14. This guideline instructs federal lawyers on how to approach arguments in cases involving competing land claims. Poilievre's argument. Guideline 14 effectively prevents federal lawyers from making the strongest possible legal argument that fee simple private property rights extinguish all other competing claims. In plain language, the client, meaning the federal government, may be limiting the arguments available to its own legal team in court. Carney responded clearly. He stated the government fundamentally disagrees with the BC Supreme Court decision. He confirmed the government filed an appeal on September 8th. He referenced ongoing support for the city of Richmond and the province of BC in related proceedings. That sounds decisive, and the appeal filing is a verifiable fact. But here is the unresolved variable that Poilievre pressed and that Carney did not fully close. As of the date of this parliamentary session, Guideline 14 remained listed on the federal government's website. If that guideline is still active, it could continue to shape how federal lawyers construct their arguments inside the very appeal Carney says he is committed to winning. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a procedural question with real legal consequences. One way to interpret this, the government filed the appeal while the internal guideline that may constrain that appeal remains in effect. Whether that creates an actual conflict in legal strategy is something that would require independent legal analysis to determine. That analysis has not been publicly released. What we know with certainty, a BC Supreme Court ruling exists. An appeal has been filed. Guideline 14 exists. Whether those three facts are in tension with each other is the unresolved question at the center of this exchange. For homeowners in BC, that unresolved question is not abstract. It affects how title searches are interpreted, how mortgage lenders assess risk on certain properties, how municipal governments approach rezoning near lands subject to active claims. None of that is resolved by a strong statement at a parliamentary podium. The appeal process will take time. The legal question is live. And that is exactly what makes the next layer of this debate so important to understand. Let me translate what you actually watched in that chamber, because what politicians say at the podium and what they are strategically executing are rarely the same thing. My job here is to close that gap. Start with the G7 comparisons. Every single time Poilievre pushed an absolute number, Carney responded with a relative one. Wages growing faster than inflation, inflation lower than the United States. Female employment 5 points above American levels. Second strongest economy in the G7. Why relative metrics consistently instead of absolute figures? One analytical interpretation. In an environment where the absolute numbers carry genuine pain, comparative framing shifts the evaluative standard. It moves the question from is life affordable right now to is Canada performing better or worse than comparable economies under the same global pressures? Those two questions lead voters to very different conclusions. This is not spin in the traditional sense. Canada's position within the G7 is a legitimate data point. But the deliberate and consistent choice to lead with comparison rather than absolute reality is a strategic communication decision, not a neutral one. Now look at the child care moment. Poilievre attacked on affordability. Carney pivoted immediately to child care, dental care, and pharmacare. On the surface, that looks like a deflection. It was not. Here is what Carney was actually executing. He was forcing a coalition retention argument in real time. The message to voters watching was not, our policies are perfect. The message was, a vote against us is a vote to dismantle programs your family currently depends on. He was not defending his record. He was making the cost of the alternative visible. That is a fundamentally different political move, and it is one that Poilievre did not have a clean answer for in that session. Now, the property rights exchange, Carney's final response deserves close reading. He said, and I am paraphrasing accurately here, that the person tossing and turning at night is the leader of the opposition trying to find new ways to divide Canadians. That single line did three things simultaneously. It dismissed the legal substance of Poilievre's argument without engaging it directly. It reframed Poilievre's entire strategy as emotionally motivated rather than legally grounded. And it positioned Carney as the adult in the room who sees through political theater. Whether that reframe is fair is a separate question. What it accomplished strategically is clear. It changed the subject from is Guideline 14 still active to who is responsible for public anxiety. Now the other side of the board, Poilievre's choice to cite Equifax rather than Statistics Canada is worth examining carefully. Equifax data is granular, real-time, and credible. It is also harder for a sitting government to immediately counter with official figures during a live parliamentary session. Statistics Canada data operates on different release cycles and would give Carney more room to dispute methodology. The Equifax numbers, if verified against the original report, represent real financial distress in real Canadian households. Using them was not irresponsible. But the framing around them, connecting insolvency data directly to Liberal policy as sole cause, moves beyond what the data itself can support. Multiple factors drive household insolvency, including interest rate trajectories set by the Bank of Canada, global credit conditions, and post-pandemic normalization patterns. The Harper nostalgia argument carries its own strategic risk. It activates older voters who associate that era with fiscal stability. But for voters under 40, Harper is not a reassuring reference point. It is a name attached to a government that left office a decade ago. That is a narrow band of emotional resonance in an increasingly diverse electorate. Here is what I found most significant in reviewing this entire exchange. Neither Carney nor Poilievre directly addressed the trade war with Washington as a structural driver of current economic conditions. Canada's export economy, energy sector pricing, and manufacturing cost base are all absorbing real pressure from ongoing tariff uncertainty with the United States. The Bank of Canada has had to navigate monetary policy under conditions that no domestic fiscal decision fully controls. One reasonable analytical inference: both leaders may have avoided this variable because neither wants to acknowledge that the single largest economic pressure on Canadian households right now originates from a decision made in Washington, not Ottawa. That silence in the chamber was louder than most of what was said. Everything we have examined so far happened at the level of parliamentary strategy and legal architecture. Now, I want to bring it down to ground level, because the three groups of Canadians I am about to describe were not in that chamber. They were not watching the exchange for rhetorical points. They are living inside the consequences of every policy decision and every unresolved legal question we just unpacked. Let me be precise about what the Cowichan ruling and the Guideline 14 question actually mean at the individual level. If you purchased a home in an area of British Columbia where active land claims exist or may exist, your title insurance, your mortgage renewal process, and your municipal zoning assumptions were all written against a legal framework that the BC Supreme Court ruling has now placed under scrutiny. This does not mean your home is at risk of being taken tomorrow. That framing would be inaccurate and irresponsible. What it does mean is this: lenders conducting risk assessments on properties in affected areas now have a live legal question they did not have 18 months ago. Title insurance underwriters are monitoring the appeals process. Municipal governments near claim areas are watching how the federal legal strategy develops before making certain long-term infrastructure commitments. None of that uncertainty disappears because a prime minister stated his position firmly at a podium. It resolves when the appeals court issues its finding, and when the federal government's legal posture, including the status of Guideline 14, is fully clarified in writing. Until then, the uncertainty is real, and it is priced into decisions being made right now. The Equifax figures cited in Parliament, insolvency volumes at 17-year highs and delinquency rates climbing 32% year over year, if confirmed against the original report, point to a specific and serious pressure concentration. Variable rate mortgage holders in Canada took on significant interest rate risk during the low rate environment of 2020 and 2021, when the Bank of Canada moved aggressively to counter inflation beginning in 2022. That risk materialized into sharply higher monthly payments for a large segment of homeowners. The question now is whether the Bank of Canada has sufficient room to reduce rates further, given that inflation, while lower than its peak, has not returned fully to the 2% target. That is not a political question. It is a monetary policy question, with a direct line to whether the insolvency trajectory in the Equifax data stabilizes or continues climbing through the remainder of 2025. No statement made in Parliament changes that calculus. Only Bank of Canada decisions do. The refinery margin argument that Carney introduced, 40 cents per liter attributed to margin increases rather than tax policy alone, points to a structural pricing dynamic that neither political party fully explained in that session. Canada's energy pricing is shaped by continental market integration with the United States, domestic refining capacity constraints, and currency exchange effects. When the Canadian dollar weakens against the American dollar, imported energy inputs become more expensive in Canadian terms regardless of who governs in Ottawa. The workers processing raw materials or operating within energy supply chains are absorbing costs that originate in decisions made across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Attributing those costs entirely to one government's tax policy or entirely to global market forces both miss the actual structural complexity. A more accurate framing, one that neither side offered that day, would acknowledge that domestic policy, continental trade conditions, and global commodity markets are all contributing variables with different weights depending on the specific cost being examined. Here's what I want you to hold on to as we move into the final section. The three groups I just described are not waiting for a better parliamentary performance. They are not moved by who controlled the rhetorical room on any given Tuesday. They are waiting for three specific things: legal clarity on property rights, a credible path for mortgage holders facing renewal pressure, and an honest accounting of how continental trade uncertainty is being factored into Canadian energy and manufacturing policy. None of those three things were fully delivered in that chamber, which brings us to what happens next. We have covered the full architecture of what happened in that chamber. Now I want to give you three honest assessments of where this goes from here. Not predictions, not guarantees. Three distinct trajectories based on the variables currently in play. The federal government moves within the coming weeks to formally clarify the status of Guideline 14, either through a public statement, a revised internal directive, or a clear legal filing that supersedes its current framing. The Cowichan appeal progresses through the courts on a normal timeline. Poilievre's property rights attack loses its primary fuel. The political pressure on this specific issue stabilizes before the summer recess. This scenario is possible. It requires the government to move proactively rather than reactively. History suggests governments move faster on legal clarification when political cost becomes visible. That cost is now visible. Guideline 14 remains unaddressed publicly. The appeals process extends into late 2025 or beyond. Similar land claim questions surface in Ontario or Alberta, expanding the geographic scope of the issue. Poilievre continues building a property rights narrative that compounds with each new development. In this scenario, the economic anxiety Carney worked to contain in that chamber does not dissipate. It accumulates. And accumulated anxiety has a way of finding political expression at moments the governing party does not choose. A significant escalation in Washington's tariff posture toward Canada, or an unexpected Bank of Canada policy shift, forces both parties to abandon their current positioning entirely and respond to a new economic reality neither has fully prepared for publicly. This is the scenario no one in Ottawa controls, and historically, it is the scenario that most frequently determines electoral outcomes. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Which of these three scenarios do you think is most likely given everything we have examined today? And more importantly, which one concerns you most personally as someone living inside the Canadian economy right now? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this analysis gave you something the standard coverage did not, subscribe. Because the next development in this story is already moving, and when it breaks, you will want the full context ready.